Good morning. Ohio's approach is hardly unique, but it is unwise as a matter of public policy because it runs counter to neuroscientific and social scientific understandings of children and their development. There are two salient points I want to make here for you. First is that children's brains are different. If any of you have children, you already intuit this and probably have had experience with how different their brains actually are. But the second point I want to make is that the definition of a juvenile sex offender is a definition created entirely in law, that there is no concrete definition of a juvenile sex offender in the social scientific literature. If I could turn first to my initial point about children's brains being different, it turns out, unsurprisingly, that children's brains, like their bodies, develop over time. Why it took us so long to figure this out, I'm not sure, since I think we have all sort of understood this on some fundamental level. But because of recent advances in technology, primarily in the MRI field, we now can see living brains and scan and map them in ways that we haven't been able to before. As a consequence, it turns out that the brain develops from the back to the front. Now, if you're hardly an expert on brain development, that probably doesn't mean much to you. But it has a really significant consequence, and it is this. The very front part of your brain is called the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is that part of your brain that helps you understand future consequences of your actions. It is the very last part of your brain to come online. Interestingly, it turns out that that part of your brain does not fully develop until somewhere between the ages of 18 and 25. Ironically, it looks like the rental car companies have got it right. You can't rent a car before you're 25, and apparently they figured this out before the neuroscientists did. What that means, though, is that there are distinct dissimilarities between adults and adolescents. There are certain abilities associated with that prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobes, and they include things like response inhibition, emotional regulation, planning and organization, and that ability to understand that your actions will have some effect down the road. It turns out that adults, of course, can use that prefrontal cortex to make certain choices, but children and teenagers end up relying on something called the amygdala, which is a more primitive part of your brain. If you think about the amygdala, that is what we refer to as your gut response. It's that fight or flight response. And that's how teens process information initially, is through that amygdala. What this really means then is that teens make decisions in very different ways. And they make decisions that to those of us with fully functioning prefrontal cortexes seem absolutely preposterous and perplexing. But the point is that juveniles do think differently. And that, I think, tells us two critically important and related facts about juveniles who are identified at the law as sex offenders. First, because adolescence is a time of dramatic change, it comes as no surprise that sexual interest and arousal are also subject to change. So juveniles who commit sexual offenses do not manifest sexual disorders in the same way that adults do. And even those juveniles who might engage in what we could characterize as sexual deviance do not necessarily manifest persistent and entrenched deviance over time. So as a practical matter, it makes it very difficult to diagnose any juvenile as a sex offender because their brains are continuing to develop. It is a fluid situation. Consequently, there is absolutely no empirically validated method for determining the likelihood of a young person to abuse again. And second, because juveniles are still developing, they're going to be more amenable to treatment than adults. So what this means is that a juvenile may never develop into a sex abuser as an adult. On the other hand, if a juvenile does appear to be trending towards sexual pathology, that juvenile is going to respond extremely well to treatment because the brain is in this fluid condition. So what I want to make clear here is that while we have a public policy that says that there are juveniles who are sex offenders and should be treated like adults in many ways because of that, there are lots and lots of sound scientific reasons why we shouldn't treat them. I want to leave you with one last image, and then I'm happy to answer any questions. If you can imagine driving a car on an unfamiliar dark road at night, you'll turn on the headlights. The those headlights, of course, illuminate the way forward for you. Juveniles have a car with headlights, but the headlights aren't connected yet. And so for them, they're driving by gut instinct. And as you can imagine, many times they're going to drive off the road. And that, I think, is the substantive difference between juveniles and adults, and why these sorts of laws are so damaging to them.